The stage lights on Il Lascio una canzone were designed for pre-teen girls belting Miley Cyrus covers, for elementary school boys attempting Michael Jackson moonwalks with training wheel coordination. The Italian RAI One Variety show, a saccharine Sunday night ratings grab launched in 2008, existed in that peculiar realm of family television where grandparents and children could share the couch without anyone reaching for the remote. It was comfort food programming, predictable and safe, where the biggest risk was a forgotten lyric or a wardrobe malfunction involving too much glitter. Then, on May 2nd, 2009, three strangers walked onto that stage and detonated a cultural paradox that would reverberate across continents. Piero Barone, 16, looked like he'd been dressed by a concerned aunt, hair gelled with the aggressive optimism of someone who'd discovered product that morning. Ignazio Boschetto, 14, possessed the gangly proportions of a boy whose skeleton had grown faster than his sense of spatial awareness. Gianluca Ginoble, 14, stood between them with the wide-eyed terror of someone who'd just realized several million people were watching. They were not a group. They had never met before this televised experiment in cultural alchemy. The show's producers, in a moment of either inspired lunacy or calculated genius, had simply looked at three individual contestants who happened to be male, young, and classically trained and thought, what if? What emerged from their mouths should have been impossible. The song was O Sole Mio, that Neapolitan warhorse so thoroughly colonized by tourist kitsch and pizza parlor soundtracks that it had long since lost any claim to artistic gravitas. But when Barone attacked the opening phrase, Che bella cosa una giornata e sole, the timbre wasn't that of a teenager. It was a spinto tenor voice, pushed and penetrating, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested lungs the size of bellows, and a diaphragm engineered by Italian nonnas who believed in the spiritual power of projected sound. When Boschetto entered with his soaring countermelody, the vocal texture shifted into something liquid and precisely controlled, each ornament placed with the calculation of a jeweler setting stones. And when Ginoble anchored the harmonic foundation with his baritone, darker, rounder, impossibly mature, the cognitive dissonance reached its apex. These were children. These were voices. The Italian audience experienced what musicologists might call perceptual incongruence. The brain's struggle to reconcile visual input, adolescent awkwardness, the slight acne visible under stage makeup, the way Boschetto kept glancing at his partners as if to confirm he was still, in fact, doing this, with auditory data that suggested men in their 30s with decades of conservatory training. The studio audience erupted not with the polite appreciation typically afforded to young performers attempting something beyond their years, but with the kind of visceral, uncontrolled ovation usually reserved for artists who've already earned their legend. Judge Pupo, a fixture of Italian pop culture, stood at his desk with tears streaming down his face. The camera caught him mouthing a single word, impossibile. The performance went viral before going viral had become the cultural imperative it is today. YouTube was only 4 years old. Social media meant Facebook and early Twitter. Yet the video spread with the kind of velocity that presaged our current algorithmic age. It accumulated millions of views, not through marketing campaigns, but through the raw gravitational pull of the improbable. Here was something the internet had not yet learned to algorithmically manufacture. Genuine, unreplicable talent emerging from complete obscurity. To understand why three Italian teenagers singing Neapolitan folk could detonate into global phenomenon, we must acknowledge what they walked into: the funeral of classical music itself. By 2009, the death of classical music narrative had calcified into accepted wisdom among cultural critics and industry analysts. Orchestra attendance had been declining for decades. The average age of classical music audiences in America hovered somewhere between retirement community and actively shopping for burial plots. Tower Records, once a cathedral for physical music consumption, had declared bankruptcy in 2006. The recording industry was in free fall, hemorrhaging revenue to Napster's children and iTunes' 99-cent singles. Classical labels were being absorbed or shuttered. Deutsche Grammophon and Decca survived only through corporate consolidation. The three tenors phenomenon of the 1990s, when Pavarotti, Domingo and Carreras had briefly convinced the world that operatic voices could coexist with World Cup soccer and stadium spectacle, had long since faded into nostalgia. Andrea Bocelli occupied a lonely middle ground, selling millions of records, while music critics debated whether he was preserving classical tradition or embalming it in adult contemporary formaldehyde. The youth demographic had moved on, entirely. Justin Bieber was ascending, discovered on YouTube and engineered for maximum teen appeal. Drake was redefining hip-hop's emotional vocabulary. Lady Gaga was turning pop music into performance art. Classical music, to the extent that young people considered it at all, existed as something their parents forced them to endure during long car rides or as soundtrack to their least favorite movie scenes, the ones without explosions. Into this cultural moment stepped three teenagers from towns most Italians couldn't locate on a map. Barone from Naro, Sicily, population 8,000. Boschetto from Bologna, yes, but raised in Marsala, another Sicilian outpost. Ginoble from Roseto degli Abruzzi, an Adriatic beach town that swells to 15,000 in summer and shrinks to irrelevance by October. None had connections to the music industry. None had the cultivated pedigree of conservatory prodigies. They were, in the most literal sense, nobodies, which would prove to be their greatest asset. Because what happened next wasn't a cynical industry plant or calculated revival. It was something stranger and more powerful. It was accidental proof that the human voice, trained to its highest capacity and deployed with youthful charisma, could still stop the world in its tracks. To understand Il Volo's acoustic alchemy requires abandoning pop criticism cliches and examining their sound with technical precision. What made them revolutionary wasn't that they sang operatic material well. It was that three distinct vocal instruments, each operating at near professional capacity, created harmonic relationships that shouldn't have been possible given their ages. Piero Barone exhibited characteristics of a tenor spinto, a pushed tenor, combining lyric beauty with dramatic power. Unlike pop singing relying on microphone amplification, operatic singing evolved to fill 2,000-seat theatres without electronics. The voice becomes its own amplification system through maximum lung capacity, precise diaphragm control, and manipulation of resonating chambers to produce squillo, that laser-like quality cutting through orchestras. Barone, at 16, was already demonstrating high-pressure high notes driven with compressed air, chiaroscuro balance, blending bright forward resonance with dark pharyngeal warmth, and precociously sophisticated passaggio navigation, the treacherous zone where voice transitions from chest to head register, executed seamlessly where less experienced singers audibly shift gears. Ignazio Boschetto was the group's precision, a tenor leggero, a light lyric tenor prized for agility and elegance. His profile revealed tessitura flexibility across his entire range, remarkable vibrato control, able to straighten tone for blend or introduce warmth for expression, and crucial bridging function in harmonic terms, occupying inner voices while maintaining distinct timbre. His genius was code switching between operatic and pop phrasing mid-song, making Il Volo intelligible to audiences who found pure opera alienating. Gianluca Ginoble's baritone was Il Volo's secret weapon. Most vocal groups emphasize high voices. Tenors attract attention. Baritones provide background. Ginoble's voice destroyed this hierarchy. His timbral darkness, acoustic energy concentrated in lower overtones, made them sound older, provided harmonic foundation preventing top heaviness, and created the sonic equivalent of full-spectrum color palette. His rhythmic precision anchored the group, and his maturity illusion, baritones suggesting adulthood and authority, signaled this wasn't novelty, but serious musicianship. When three voices sing together, they don't simply stack, they interact, creating combination tones, reinforcement patterns, and blend characteristics. Il Volo's blend exhibited formant alignment, resonance peaks creating illusion of one super voice, strategic vowel matching across their native Italian, absence of vibrato conflict, and constant dynamic micro-adjustments. Three voices created a wall of sound, a human orchestra with melody, harmony, bass line, and rhythm, all generated by vocal cords, breath, and centuries-old technique deployed with 21st century charisma. Tony Rennis and Michel Torpedine, the architects of Il Volo, understood both commercial potential and creative landmines of operatic crossover. Rennis, then 71, was an unlikely revolutionary. A successful singer-songwriter who'd represented Italy at Eurovision in 1962, written hits for everyone from Shirley Bassey to Celine Dion, and produced Andrea Bocelli's most successful albums, Rennis understood both the commercial potential and the creative landmines of operatic crossover. He'd watched the three tenors phenomenon from the inside. He'd crafted Bocelli's brand with surgical precision. He knew that the popera audience, affluent, aging, hungry for beauty without the homework of understanding, was underserved and loyal. But Rennis also recognized the formula was growing stale. Il Divo had become predictable. Bocelli, approaching his 50s, represented an older generation. The crossover genre was beginning to calcify into something your parents listened to, which is death for any musical movement claiming vitality. The solution was radical in its simplicity. What if you could find the artistic credibility of classical training and combine it with the demographic appeal of youth? Not precocious children. The Charlotte Church model had proven unsustainable. But teenagers, old enough to have developed serious vocal technique, young enough to seem like discovery rather than calculation. Michel Torpedine, Rennis's partner in this experiment, brought the A&R instincts of someone who'd spent decades identifying talent for Sony and Universal. When he watched that May 2009 Ti lascio una canzone broadcast, he saw something the audience had felt but couldn't articulate. These three voices, accidentally combined, created a blend that didn't exist anywhere in the market. The pitch to the boys and their families was, by industry standards, insane. This was 2009. The music industry was in crisis. Physical sales had collapsed. Streaming revenue was negligible. Labels were dropping artists with proven track records. Classical labels wouldn't touch them. Too pop. Pop labels couldn't figure them out. Too classical. Radio had no format for operatic voices that weren't Bocelli. The business case for Il Volo was approximately zero. Except for one thing, that Ti lascio una canzone performance had revealed an audience the industry had forgotten existed. The YouTube views came not just from Italy, but from Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Japan, and the United States. The comments sections, in a dozen languages, suggested something extraordinary. This was somehow both niche and universal, both culturally specific, operatic Italian tradition, and emotionally accessible to listeners who'd never attended an opera. Rennis and Torpedine made a gamble that would define the next decade. They would build Il Volo not through the traditional music industry infrastructure, which had no template for them, but through the cracks and margins. Through PBS specials that reached older Americans, through touring markets in Latin America where operatic voices were still culturally resonant, through international partnerships that bypassed the collapsing US radio model entirely. Their first album, Il Volo, 2010, positioned them in no man's land. Too polished for classical purists, too operatic for pop radio, too young for the Bocelli audience, too old-fashioned for teenagers. It debuted at number 10 on the Billboard 200. In 2010, when Lady Gaga, Eminem, and Justin Bieber dominated charts, three Italian teenagers singing standards in their native language cracked the top 10. It reached number 1 on Billboard's classical chart and stayed there for 56 consecutive weeks. The traditional path to American musical stardom in the early 2000s was algorithmic in its predictability. Radio play, MTV exposure, guest appearances on late-night television, strategic iTunes playlist placement, social media amplification, arena tours opening for established acts. This machinery, refined over decades, transformed regional successes into national phenomena with industrial efficiency. Il Volo had access to precisely none of it. Top 40 radio, the single most powerful hit-making apparatus in American music, had no format for operatic tenors singing in Italian. They were too classical for pop stations, too pop for classical programming, too foreign language for the xenophobic American market that had historically resisted even English-language imports. MTV and its descendants had long since abandoned music programming for reality shows. Youth-oriented talk shows that launched Justin Bieber and One Direction had no interest in three Italians whose target demographic appeared to be their hosts' grandmothers. So Tony Rennis and Michelle Torpedine engineered something stranger. They would conquer America through its cultural margins, through the institutions that the music industry had long since written off as irrelevant to contemporary hit-making. They would use PBS. The public broadcasting service, by 2010, occupied a peculiar space in American media, simultaneously invisible to anyone under 40 and religiously watched by the aging, affluent, educated demographic that represented classical music's core audience. PBS's Great Performances series, broadcasting opera, ballet, and classical concerts since 1972, commanded a loyal viewership of approximately 2 to 3 million per episode, tiny by network standards, but massive for classical content. More importantly, this was an audience with disposable income, with CD purchasing habits that hadn't migrated to streaming, with a demonstrated appetite for exactly what Il Volo was selling: high-quality music performed with technical excellence, packaged in a format that didn't require the homework of attending an opera house. The strategy was elegant. If you couldn't reach young Americans, who'd largely abandoned linear television, reach their parents and grandparents, who still watched programming guides and made appointment viewing decisions. Create a PBS special that would position Il Volo not as a novelty act, but as inheritors of a grand tradition. Then leverage that credibility into concert tours and album sales. Il Volo takes flight, broadcast in 2012, was the Trojan horse. Filmed in Miami before a carefully curated audience of classical music enthusiasts and featuring a set list that mixed Italian standards with accessible pop covers, the special did something crucial. It gave American viewers permission to enjoy Il Volo without the guilt of lowering their standards. The special drew 1.8 million viewers. Extraordinary for PBS, catastrophic for broadcast networks, but perfectly calibrated for Il Volo's purposes. Because those 1.8 million viewers were concentrated in the exact demographic most likely to buy albums, attend concerts, and evangelize to friends. Within weeks, Il Volo's second studio album debuted at #1 on the Billboard Classical Chart and #10 on the Billboard 200. The PBS strategy had a second-order effect that traditional marketing couldn't replicate: generational transmission. The grandmothers and grandfathers watching PBS didn't just become fans themselves. They introduced Il Volo to their families, bought albums as gifts, brought grandchildren to concerts. Il Volo became that rare phenomenon, music that families could share across generational divides. But PBS was merely the foundation. The real validation came from Barbra Streisand. When she chose Il Volo as opening act for her 2012 North American tour, the music industry was baffled. But Streisand recognized they represented a hybrid that hadn't existed: classical training meeting pop accessibility, European sophistication meeting, American entrepreneurialism, youth meeting tradition. The tour was graduate education in American concert culture, exposing them to affluent audiences who attended classical concerts, subscribed to opera series, viewed music as art. When Barbra Streisand gave implicit approval by sharing her stages, it settled questions about whether Il Volo was real or manufactured. Concert audience analysis from 2013 to 2014 revealed something unprecedented: bimodal age distribution. Roughly 40% of their audience was over 55, the PBS demographic, classical enthusiasts, the generation remembering the three tenors. But 35% was under 25, predominantly female, attracted by youth, charisma, romantic Italian appeal, and parasocial relationship dynamics. This shouldn't have been possible. These demographics had nothing in common. Yet there they were, sharing concert halls. To older audiences, they represented preservation of tradition. Young people valuing beauty, technique, and artistry in an age of auto-tune. They were grandmother approved, safe, wholesome. To younger audiences, they were the anti-boy band. Where One Direction relied on synchronized choreography and managed personas, Il Volo offered rawness and authenticity. They couldn't dance and didn't try. They wore suits rather than streetwear, demonstrated actual musical talent that couldn't be faked. Most importantly, they occupied a space allowing young female fans to express interest without cultural baggage of basic taste. Liking Justin Bieber invited mockery. Liking Il Volo suggested sophistication. The mechanism, familial transmission. Young fans discovered Il Volo through family members, then recruited friends through social media. Older fans attended concerts with daughters and granddaughters, creating shared experiences transcending generational divides. By early 2015, Il Volo had achieved peculiar success. Globally recognized, commercially viable, critically respected, and in danger of calcifying into a nostalgia act. They'd become predictable, each release reinforcing their brand as custodians of dying tradition rather than artists with anything new to say. Grande Amore was their defibrillator, proving their hearts still beat with contemporary relevance. The Sanremo Music Festival, running since 1951, is where Italian pop music receives its benediction. Il Volo's decision to compete was simultaneously obvious and insane. Obvious because it was the most visible platform in Italian music. Insane because they were already internationally successful and didn't need validation. More problematically, they needed an original song, not the standards and covers defining their career. Grande Amore, written by Francesco Boccia and Ciro Esposito, was engineered to split the difference between operatic foundation and contemporary pop sensibility. Conventional pop structure, but melodic writing demanding operatic technique. The chorus peaked on sustained high notes, requiring proper breath support and squillo. Harmonies were architecturally complex. Dynamics built from intimate verses to full voice climaxes. Lyrically, Grande Amore was unabashedly romantic, almost defiantly so in an era when irony dominated pop music. Ti seguo come un'ombra, finché la notte cadrà. This was Italian romantic tradition, earnest and passionate, opposite of cool detachment. When Il Volo performed at the Sanremo final on February 14, 2015, Valentine's Day, they detonated the festival's equilibrium. Three voices in perfect harmonic balance, building through controlled intensity, then exploding into a chorus filling the theatre with acoustic power no electronic enhancement could replicate. The televote? 297,000 votes, approximately 37% of all votes cast. Il Volo won Sanremo 2015 in a landslide, earning automatic Eurovision qualification. The Eurovision Song Contest is simultaneously prestigious and ridiculous, politically significant and utterly absurd. It's where ABBA launched their career, where Celine Dion represented Switzerland, where pop careers are made and destroyed. Il Volo arrived in Vienna in May 2015 as something unusual. They were already successful. They didn't need Eurovision, which meant they could approach it without desperation. The competition featured typical Eurovision spectacle. Sweden's Måns Zelmerlöw with elaborate projection mapping. Russia's Polina Gagarina with dramatic costume changes. Australia's Guy Sebastian with contemporary pop soul. Productions designed for television, for viral moments. Il Volo walked on stage in simple black suits. No dancers, no costume changes, no elaborate staging. Just three voices, an orchestra, and Grande Amore. Eurovision uses hybrid voting. Professional juries, 50%, plus public televoting, 50%. The juries placed Il Volo third, appreciation without enthusiasm, recognition of technical excellence coupled with skepticism about contemporary relevance. The televote told a different story. When public votes were revealed, Il Volo had won by a landslide. 366 points, far ahead of Russia's 279 and Sweden's 217. Across 39 countries, from Iceland to Azerbaijan, the public voted for operatic voices over contemporary pop production. Final combined score placed Il Volo third overall. Jury votes had counteracted popular will. But the discrepancy between professional judgment and popular choice became the story, raising uncomfortable questions about musical expertise versus audience preference. The Eurovision televote revealed something the industry had been ignoring. There existed a massive pan-European audience hungry for melody, for voices that hadn't been auto-tuned into synthetic perfection, for emotional directness over ironic detachment. The term Il Volo Effect began appearing in music industry analysis around 2016, used to describe a phenomenon that data analysts were struggling to explain. A measurable uptick in classical crossover album sales, increased enrollment in voice conservatories among teenage boys, and, most surprisingly, streaming data suggesting that younger listeners were suddenly seeking out operatic content that algorithms hadn't recommended and that cultural gatekeepers had declared dead. But to truly understand what Il Volo accomplished, we need to examine not just the commercial metrics, but the cultural machinery they rewired. The death of classical music narrative that dominated cultural criticism in the 2000s wasn't mere pessimism. It was based on demonstrable trends. National Endowment for the Arts data from 2008 showed that Americans aged 18 to 24 attending classical music performances had declined from 11.6% in 1982 to just 7.6% in 2008, a generational collapse. Orchestra bankruptcies accelerated. The Louisville Orchestra, the Syracuse Symphony, the Honolulu Symphony all ceased operations between 2008 and 2011. The average age of classical concert attendees in major American cities was approaching 65, suggesting that the genre was dying with its audience. Classical music as a living art form seemed to be in hospice care. Il Volo didn't reverse these trends entirely. Classical music's institutional challenges persisted, but they created something unexpected. A gateway through which young people could approach operatic voices without the cultural homework that typically gatekept the genre. The mechanism was elegant. They removed barriers to entry without dumbing down the content. You didn't need to understand Italian to appreciate Grande Amore. The melody and vocal power communicated emotionally, regardless of language. You didn't need to know the difference between bel canto and verismo to hear that these voices were doing something technically extraordinary. You didn't need a conservatory education to distinguish Barone's spinto intensity from Ginoble's baritone warmth. Your ears could hear the difference, even if you lacked vocabulary to articulate it. Most crucially, Il Volo made operatic singing seem like something young people could do rather than something museums preserved. The typical exposure to opera for most Americans was through the Phantom of the Opera, or the occasional Pavarotti reference. Distant, historical, performed by people who seemed to exist in a different cultural universe. But here were three guys in their 20s, on Instagram, cracking jokes, doing normal 20-something things, who happened to possess these extraordinary voices. The effect was measurable. Applications to voice programs at American conservatories, which had been declining for years, showed a 12% increase between 2010 and 2015, with music school administrators specifically noting an uptick in teenage boys citing Il Volo as inspiration. YouTube channels dedicated to classical vocal technique saw subscriber growth that correlated directly with Il Volo's touring schedule. Spotify's classical crossover playlists, which had been algorithmic graveyards, started showing meaningful engagement from listeners under 30. But more importantly, Il Volo created a vocabulary through which Gen Z and millennials could express interest in beauty without irony. Contemporary youth culture in the 2000s had become thoroughly ironized. Sincerity was suspect, emotional directness was cringe, Admitting that something moved you was vulnerable in ways that social media surveillance made dangerous. Il Volo provided permission to care about something beautiful without defensive irony, to be moved by three voices in harmony without needing to qualify that response with cynicism, to argue that Il Volo saved classical crossover risks overstating their impact, but it's worth examining what the genre looked like before and after their emergence. Pre-2009, classical crossover had ossified into a handful of predictable templates. The Andrea Bocelli model, aging tenor, sentimental repertoire, dinner party background music. The Il Divo model, manufactured multinational vocal group. The Celtic woman model, pretty voices, pretty dresses, yoga class soundtracks. These were commercially successful, but artistically moribund. Il Volo injected youth, masculinity, and genuine vocal firepower into a genre that had become synonymous with middle-aged safety. Their success created commercial proof that the audience for classical crossover wasn't limited to relaxed fit jeans demographics, that younger listeners would engage with operatic voices if the packaging and presentation acknowledged their existence. The industry responded. Between 2012 and 2018, labels began signing and promoting classical crossover acts with energy they hadn't shown in a decade. These acts didn't all sound like Il Volo, but they all benefited from Il Volo having proven that classical adjacent music could chart, could sell tickets, could build audiences outside the traditional classical music infrastructure. As Il Volo enter their second decade as a performing group, an eternity in contemporary music where most acts struggle to maintain relevance beyond their second album, the question shifts from how did they succeed to what does their success mean? They're no longer teenagers. Barone is 31, Boschetto and Ginoble are 29 as of this writing. The voices that were miraculously mature at 14 and 16 have now settled into their adult configuration, deepened and darkened in ways that vocal pedagogy predicted but couldn't guarantee. Barone's spinto tenor has acquired the heft and squillo of a fully mature operatic voice. Boschetto's lyric tenor has maintained its agility while gaining power. Ginoble's baritone has become a properly dark, rich instrument that could command actual operatic roles. They've performed at the Vatican for multiple popes, sung at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony, recorded tribute albums to everyone from Placido Domingo to Ennio Morricone. Their 2016 album, Notte Magica, recorded live at the Pompeii Amphitheatre, backed by a full orchestra, reached #1 on the Billboard Classical chart and top 10 on the Billboard 200, achievements that had become almost routine, expected. But routine is the enemy of art, and the question confronting Il Volo in their third decade is whether they can continue evolving or will calcify into exactly what they disrupted. A nostalgia act, perpetually performing their greatest hits, coasting on past achievements, becoming the very museum piece they once made vital. Early evidence suggests they understand this challenge. Their recent work has incorporated more original Italian songwriting, collaborations with contemporary Italian pop producers, and carefully curated performances that balance preservation with innovation. They've begun accepting actual operatic roles. Ginoble sang Escamillo in a 2022 Carmen production. Barone has performed concert versions of Tosca, proving that their voices can handle the demands of full operatic repertoire, not just crossover material. More intriguingly, they've begun serving as ambassadors and advocates for young classical vocalists, using their platform to promote voice education, to fund conservatory scholarships, to make the case that classical training matters in an era of auto-tune and synthetic production. This is the work of artists who understand they've been granted something rare, commercial success combined with artistic credibility, and who recognize an obligation to pay it forward. The pessimistic interpretation of Il Volo's career is that they represent an unrepeatable accident, a collision of talent, timing, and luck that created something beautiful but unsustainable. This view holds that the conditions that produced them, three compatible voices, discovered on television, developed by experienced management, emerging at exactly the moment when classical crossover needed revitalization, are too specific to replicate. The optimistic interpretation is that they've created a blueprint, proof that classical training and contemporary careers aren't mutually exclusive, that young people will respond to operatic voices if the presentation respects their intelligence and cultural context, that the mechanisms of viral success work for classical crossover as well as any other genre. The truth, as usual, exists somewhere between these poles. Il Volo probably can't be precisely replicated. Their specific blend of voices, personalities, and cultural moment was unique. But the principles they demonstrated are replicable. Prioritize genuine vocal excellence. Respect your audience's intelligence. Bridge rather than choose between tradition and innovation. We're already seeing second-generation Il Volo effects. Teenage tenors posting classical arias on TikTok and going viral. Vocal groups forming in their wake. Classical crossover artists finding audiences through YouTube and Spotify rather than traditional classical music infrastructure. Perhaps the deepest lesson is simpler. The human voice, trained to its absolute limit and deployed with authentic emotion, remains the most powerful instrument in existence. In an era of electronic music, of synthesizers that can generate any sound imaginable, of auto-tune that can correct any imperfection, of artificial intelligence that can compose music without human intervention, there is something irreducibly human about three people standing before a microphone and singing. The breath moving through bodies, the vocal cords vibrating at specific frequencies, the acoustic waves traveling through space and hitting eardrums. This is ancient technology, unchanged since humans first discovered they could make meaningful sounds with their throats. Il Volo proved this ancient technology is inherently viral, inherently compelling, inherently capable of stopping people in their algorithm-driven, attention-shattered scrolling. Because when you hear something genuinely extraordinary, something that you know required years of dedication and natural talent to achieve, something that can't be faked or enhanced or replicated by machines, your brain responds with wonder and attention that no amount of production polish or marketing sophistication can manufacture. This is why their lascio, canzone performance went viral before they had marketing budgets. This is why their Eurovision televote crushed the competition. This is why they've sold out concert halls for 15 years without a #1 pop hit. Three teenagers from obscure Italian towns walked onto a stage in 2009 and, through some combination of talent, training, and cosmic luck, proved that the human voice remains the most viral instrument we possess. 15 years later, they're still proving it, whether as the last exemplars of a dying tradition or the blueprints for its unexpected revival. The answer depends on whether anyone is still listening. But if Il Volo taught us anything, it's that when the singing is good enough, extraordinary enough, authentic enough, people will always listen.